I'm Sarah Martindale from the University of Nottingham. My role today is to provide an introduction to our work and in doing so set up the rest of our session. After that point, I'm going to be monitoring the chat and making a note of questions for discussion. So please do share your thoughts with us in the chat box, and we will come back to those and respond to them all together in the final 15 minutes of the session. Next slide, please. So the project that we're talking to you about today is all about the connected museum. So the first point that it's therefore important to address is what we mean by a connected museum. And overall, the vision we share is twofold. Firstly, it's to help museums extend their reach and broaden their audiences by adopting digital technologies to make new kinds of connections between their visitors, exhibits, sites, and interpretations. And secondly, it's to enable visitors, artifacts, and also stories to move between museums, both physically and virtually. And by doing that, stimulate richer forms of cross-cultural exchange while also opening up new business opportunities. And shortly, Gabriella Giannacci from the University of Exeter will provide us with some more information about the ideas that underpin these kind of core aims of the project. So this need to find alternative ways of connecting museums and their artifacts and visitors is because of barriers to connecting museums internationally. So these barriers include the nature of collections, which are precious, rivalrous, and notoriously difficult to tour due to their fragility and the associated insurance costs. Another barrier is the fact that artifacts cannot simply be transplanted from one cultural context to another. And in addition, the reliance on visitors traveling long distances may no longer be viable in the future. And these were the barriers that we identified prior to 2020 and the global pandemic. And of course, these have been hugely exacerbated by COVID and its impacts. And we're going to have this afternoon Hilary Knight from Tate, who will explain these additional challenges that have arisen due to COVID-19 and how the sector is responding to them. As a starting point, our project set out to explore a number of technical possibilities, which we categorised according to whether visitors or artefacts physically move or project their presence remotely. So, for example, if you look at the four quadrants here, in the top left, when visitors travel to museums in other countries, they might, for example, use or create a personalised digital tour as part of that experience. Or if we think about artefacts that are moving, it could be that digital stories accrue around those artifacts as they travel between museums and encounter new audiences. Or if we think about how visitors could project their presence, that could be using virtual reality to interact with artifacts in museum environments which are physically far away. Or if we think about artifacts, we could think how those which are physically far away could be projected into a local museum environment. But of course, all the practical restrictions imposed by the pandemic have limited the technical possibilities that we're actually able to explore in the research, given that neither people nor artifacts can travel at the moment. Visitors can't necessarily even get into museums, and shared technologies like headsets and touchscreens are not currently safe to use. So Jocelyn Spence from the University of Nottingham is going to be introducing us to one technology, the GIFT app, which we are able to use at the moment to connect with people around this topic. Ultimately, what the whole project has had to do is pivot to focus on remote projection rather than any sort of physical movement of visitors and artifacts, in order to achieve greater connection between museums in China and the UK. And it's important to remember that this pivot not only applies to the kind of digital technologies that we want to produce, but also to the methods that we're having to use to collaborate. Because the original plan for the project was a series of visits and longer staff exchanges, and a kind of structured ideation process where everybody was together in person. But the impossibility of this means that we're having to innovate in our methods to suit the circumstances as well. And so our final speaker today, Steve Benford from the University of Nottingham, will explain the work that we've been doing to find digital alternatives for physical processes like workshopping ideas. So without further ado, I will hand over to Gabriella to tell you a bit about the background to the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'll be talking to you about the Museum of Me and personalized museum experiences. So the notion of personalization appears to have surfaced more or less simultaneously to other trends in museum exhibition practice, such as participation or activism. The term could implicate both the curation of an individual's life as a form of exhibition, what I call here the Museum of Me, as well as the tailoring of the visiting experience to be as individual, as subjective as possible. The first is largely driven by past and current trends in art practice, and the second is perhaps driven by curation, exhibition, and marketing. The first one has to do with the way we construct our identity, often through performance or performativity. The second one has to do with the fact that museums need to make sure people visit more than once, that content and interpretation is tailored towards them, and that people are as satisfied as possible by the visiting experience. So what does it mean to create personalized visiting experiences? What is a Museum of Me? And how can one present or construct oneself in or as a museum? Of course, museum exhibits historically stem from personal collections, and we all know that cabinets of curiosity are a great example of the significance played by personal collections in the museum context. Another great example is the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's new wing, which opened in 2016 to host the Doris and Donald Fisher collection. In both cases, as we look at the collections, we are inside someone else's mind, part of their world. And in this sense, for a moment, we become them. And next slide, please. In my book, Archive Everything, Mapping the Everyday, I have shown that since the time of the Second World War, an increasing number of artists use a whole variety of archival methods to curate, store, exhibit, and even sell their work. These artists produce works that could be described as personal collections or archives. Archives for them were a method, a practice. Now, two great examples are Marcel Duchamp's The Box in a Valise from 1941, which famously consisted of a box containing a collection of 69 reproductions of Duchamp's past artwork enclosed in a valise, and Andy Warhol's Time Capsules from 1975, a serial work formed by 610 standard-sized cardboard boxes, each containing around 200 objects that document the life of the artist, including cans of soup, unseen artworks, dead bees, a pair of shoes that once belonged to the actor Clark Gable, and many other things that I don't have time to list now. Next slide, please. In more recent times, personalized visiting has often occurred through the development of new technologies. Some museums have encouraged visitors to curate collections, as is the case of Seattle's Frye Museum's Social Medium, a 2014 exhibition which consisted entirely of selections made by visitors using social media. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston also used Popular Vote to select paintings to be included in the Boston Loves Impressionism exhibition, also held in 2014, and similar projects in the UK have been carried out at the British Museum, the Museum of London, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, among others. Personalization could also mean reaching out into visitors' personal lives. Next slide, please. So the Take Me, I'm Yours show at Milano Bicocca in 2015, which originally opened at the Serpentine Gallery in 1995, curated by Kristin Boltanski and Hans Ulbricht Obrist, visitors were encouraged to pick objects and take them home, thus in effect bringing the museum into their own lives. Personalized visiting is often delivered through apps, either by creating paths for exhibitions or facilitating direct contact with museum staff. For example, New York's American Museum of Natural History's Explorer app asks visitors to select their interests and only after that recommends their path through the museum. The Bloomberg-supported app, which uses beacon technology, includes AR functions and makes it possible to share the visitors' experiences through social media. Meanwhile, the Brooklyn Museum app Ask allowed people to send a question to the museum, and a process described by New York Times critic Daniel McDermott as being like having a curator in your pocket. Next slide, please. So why are these reflections relevant in the context of the Beyond Conference? Soon after the onset of the pandemic, we met with Paul Meller to assess the risk involved in working internationally at this point in time and decided that to overcome the fact that we could not travel and that our partner museums had been closed in both China and the UK, we would focus on creating a museum of me by asking people in both China and the UK to share or gift histories to do with their personal heritage to each other through the gift app that we'll talk about in a minute. By personal heritage here, I mean objects to do with us and the stories associated with them. As in the case of the Cabinets of Curiosity in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art Fisher collection, we know that a personal collection can tell a lot about the collector and their world. So the Museum of Me we aim to create in this project, whereby me I mean all participants to this transcultural museum, could well constitute a significant step in setting out a space where we could enter each other's worlds and for a moment see what is most personal to us with each other's eyes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to pick up the thread now and just address head on a little bit some of the challenges that the current pandemic has brought to our doorsteps. And we've all been affected by COVID-19 at work and in our lives. And it's been a very a global phenomenon, but swept across the globe in waves. So the experience of the pandemic has not been universally distributed. So I'm going to reflect on this for a couple of minutes. And like many of the speakers we've heard today, and as Sarah highlighted at the start of this talk, we planned multiple trips to China this year. We wanted to find ways to work in collaborative partnership, and we were particularly interested in co-creation. In fact, one of the pieces we wish to study as part of this research project is how might we create toolkits for co-creation between the UK and China. But collaboration requires relationship, and relationship building is a challenge when you're doing it remotely. And as humans, we really seek out that sort of in-person contact as an important way of creating working partnerships. So I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has hit us in two particular ways. And so I'm going to talk about them just in a couple of slides, and these really are the headlines. There's a lot more detail underneath this as everybody has been trying to pivot to adapt. But the very first of them, and the biggest of this impact has been on us as an organization at Tate, but also our partner organizations in Shanghai and of course our academic partners. And particularly with the museum institutions, we have had to manage our own responses to the pandemic. We've had to close our buildings, we've had to furlough our staff, and this has been particular on a institution by institution basis, which has made working in partnership across a geographic and time zone and cultural and language divide additionally challenging, as people aren't always available when you want to speak to them, and museums have been closed at different times. China's lockdown began before ours, and they've re-emerged into public life as we are now in a second lockdown. And this speaks to the different national responses in the UK and China, which has repercussions for our audiences in the two countries. the British public's experience of COVID-19, the impact it's had on our audience lives and their ability to visit galleries and engage in in-person cultural experience is very different to what is currently being experienced by audiences in Shanghai. And you know, I'm sure we're all feeling the pain of lack of in-person contact, but remote working is challenging, and remote working can amplify the challenges that exist when you're trying to forge new working relationships that have to span and cross geographical and time zone limitations, but also cultural and linguistic and language barriers, which so sometimes it has slowed things down. Basically, it has made things much slower. We've had to be very much more explicit. We've had to deploy lots and lots of different forms of remote working technology and remote meeting style and workshopping style technology. But we also have to work harder as individuals to make sure that we're forging those real human connections. And I suppose I'm segueing now into talking to the adaptation on that. So in some respects, we've had to reset our relationships and go back to the start and reaffirm why it is we're working together. We've had to incorporate new ways of working and be explicit about how we're going to do that. And that's required us to unpick and actually really examine our own business etiquettes and assumptions about what it is we bring as the UK contingent of this partnership to the table. And this is challenging, but also kind of fascinating. And so actually we have incorporated how the project adapts to COVID and lockdown and pandemic and having to work remotely into the research proposition and the output. So we're going to be sort of studying ourselves as we adapt. Next slide, please. And then the second major area is, of course, the creative impact. And as Sarah spoke about at the start, the access to museum spaces, access to civic and public space is very, very limited here in the UK. We also know from our audience research that our audiences are perceiving an increased risk for in-person experiences. They are very wary, even when they're able to turn up, and they're reassessing the position of a museum visit in their cultural lives. However, on the flip side, they have also experienced vastly accelerated use of personal digital technologies and are now very well versed in Zoom and the other sort of virtual meeting technologies that were just alien to most of our general public audiences until much earlier this year. And our audiences now have very different expectations of what they want from a digital experience from a cultural institution than they had before lockdown. We have all moved online, institutions and audiences alike, and that has changed the nature of our relationship. So actually the proposition that we would scope out now might be different, or is different frequently, than a proposition we might have scoped out earlier this year, simply because, frankly, digital literacy and digital capability and capacity has been fast-tracked on both sides between content creator and audience member. So our adaptation to this is to change the proposition of and tweak and refine the proposition of what it is we're wanting to experiment with and the prototypes we aim to build. So the risk that we now feel in terms of being in enclosed spaces, we don't know how long it will be before people are able to convene in enclosed rooms. I expect it'll be many years before everybody's happy to share an on-face VR headset. So we need to change our proposition to be outside, less reliant on physical locations, and reduce or eliminate shared touch surfaces. And all of this sees a very swift move from installed technology in a museum to audiences using their own devices as something that feels much safer and much more immediate. And actually, these adaptations also present opportunities, because there are opportunities in here to scale, opportunities here to explore new ways of connecting with audiences and break new ground. And we hope, as has always been part of this project, to explore new business models as well. And what we're going to be talking about today is about gifting specifically and mobile specifically, but I just a little nudge, that a reminder that as part of this endeavor, we are actually proposing two prototypes, which gifting is only one. The other we might have to come back and talk about another time. And that's it from me.
Hello, my name is Jocelyn Spence, and I'm a researcher at the University of Nottingham. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about the specific tool that we're starting out with, which is this gift app that Gabriella teased us with, and that Hillary has so kindly led us into. And this is a project that we just finished. And when I say we, again, that is on behalf of a much, much larger project. It was a Horizon 2020 funded project that finished last December. And one of the outcomes of it was the app that I'm about to show you. The premise of the app was digital gifting of museum objects, which on the face of it seems completely contradictory. I can't give you a museum object, it's not mine to give. So we had the artist group Blast Theory make some sense of it for us. And I want to just give you a quick overview through their video of what they came up with, and then I'll discuss it a bit more, if I can get this to play nicely.
You're going to make a gift for someone special. They might be next to you right now. They might be on the other side of the world. Let that person be your filter as you walk. Ignore the things you know they're not going to care about. Go and learn more about the objects you know nothing about. The first thing you choose, why is it right for this person?
So I trust everyone can hear me again and everything's all right. So just to give you some glimpses of this app in close up. So the first thing they ask you to do after you hear that introductory video is to ask you to think of a specific individual that you want to give a gift to. So you are immediately walking in there with a person in mind, and it's likely to be a person who's close to you. And as you heard, they invite you to think about this person and immerse yourself in this sort of audioscape, with a very personal, as you heard, very personal sort of tone. She's speaking as if she knows you. It goes on to say, oh, we all know what it feels like when you get a gift that somebody's really not thought about. And so you're immediately put in this very emotional frame of mind. And then you're invited to take pictures of objects that you would wish to give to that person, and then record for them with your own voice why it is that you chose it for them. So we've had some amazing findings. So just to highlight a few of them, the highlight is that they're very experiential and very emotional responses that we tended to get from people. Not everybody, of course, but from an awful lot of people. They talked about seeing the entire museum with new eyes, seeing things they'd never noticed before, going places they'd never been before, feeling more emotionally connected to the objects, feeling more emotionally connected to the receivers they were making the gift for, or for the receivers we spoke to, feeling more emotionally connected to their givers. We had some really touching moments in there, as well as some very lighthearted ones. There was a range for basically any type of engagement people wanted to invest. And also it depended quite a lot on voice. So you heard the voice of the narrator there. The way that was scripted and the way it was delivered was very, very specifically designed. And then you also had this issue of speaking in a museum space, which if you're just talking into your phone, people don't do. So true, quite a lot of people found this to be very uncomfortable at first, but the ones who didn't give up, which is most of them, they persevered, they did it. They might've gone off into a corner to find a private spot. But after the first one, if they chose to have a second or third component to their gift, they found it very easy, very natural, and not a problem at all. So what we wanted to do was to take that work that was produced for another project and see what happened if we adapted it to a Chinese context so that we could use it in China. So the first step was to simply get feedback from English-speaking Chinese people working in pairs, giver and receiver, giving to each other. And then the next step was going to be translating it in terms of just the language and learning from both the feedback and from the language translation, then do a sort of full cultural translation, see what sort of changes we would need to make. So just to show you the tiny adaptation we did, if you look in the center one here, I'm pointing as if you can see. If you look in the center one, there's a little speech bubble. If you touch that, you can see a printout of what the speaker is saying. So if you're struggling to understand the accent or anything, then you can at least read it. So to hit very quickly, what we found was the known unknowns. We knew that there would possibly be differences in attitude, what you expect from a museum visit, what you expect from tech, what you expect from a gift, and also the situation of lockdown. We had to adapt this, as mentioned before. So it was either going to an actual museum of your choice or your quote unquote museum of everyday life, AKA your flat, your house. And I will run through these very quickly. I'm not going to go through the findings in any detail, but just to again highlight that the feedback that we originally got from our Chinese speakers and our Chinese people from Chinese backgrounds who are also Chinese speakers was that their expectations were often spoken of in very transactional or practical terms about museums being for information gathering, but their responses when they went through the app were just as emotional and experiential as what we saw with our primarily UK-based, international sometimes, but not any particular nation users. So we had transactional expectations and emotional responses. And then we had the unknown unknowns, which had to do in most part with how important it is to have an actual Chinese project partner in China doing legwork in China, because among other things, recruitment is a very different thing according to Chinese expectations, especially if you're working with university students, which we often tend to start with as our initial cohort before we go into the wild. And that's pretty much what we found. So I will turn over now to Professor Benford.
Hi there, thank you. Yeah, I'm Steve. Thanks, Jocelyn. And if we could take the next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about something different, talk about methods. How can we work together to create new hybrid visiting museum experiences between the UK and China? And in particular, how can we do that when we can't travel in the middle of a pandemic? Short answer, I could cut this talk very short, I don't know, but with some ideas. And one of the main ones is to think about using ideation cards and bringing those online. I don't know if you're familiar with ideation cards as a design method. They emerged from a number of sources. Musician Brian Eno, the company IDEO were among kind of early innovators with them, and they've since spread like wildfire. And essentially what you get with ideation cards is you get a deck of cards, physical cards, and those cards break a complex design space of concepts down into bite-sized chunks. Each card is a concept, and you can go through the cards one at a time and kind of think about them and learn as you go. Like any other deck of cards, you also get rules for playing with them. And one of the nice things about design cards is you can play ideation games, and you can use those rules to kind of mess around with the turn taking to make sure that everyone gets a voice, to introduce randomness or lots of other kind of constraints and opportunities into the design process. If we take the next slide, please. So at the start of the project, we had a deck of ideation cards targeted at museums available. It's called Visitor Box. You can find out more, download digital copies, and a lot of guidance on how to use it from visitorbox.org, just about readable on the slide there. This had emerged from a previous AHRC project and already been used by quite a large number of museums throughout the UK and Europe. And essentially, Visitor Box gives you a structured ideation process for coming up with a new museum experience. There are broadly 5 phases that the rules take you through, understanding your context, your goals. From those, you create a design brief, then generating ideas, and then disrupting those ideas and challenging them. And there are various suites of cards. There are over 100 cards in the deck for thinking about audiences, assets, goals. Well, you can read them for yourself. If you take a look at Visitor Box, you'll see there are the cards there. You can download them. There are suggested rules and a cheat sheet of how to get started quickly. And there are also some worksheets you can get your participants to fill in. So take a look, and if you're into museum design or experience design, have a go with Visitor Box. So a couple of other things to say. At the start of the project, we were interested in using Visitor Box, and it went out on an early trip to China. And in bringing the cards out, we sensed some potential in using it to kind of explore designs between UK and China, although recognizing that the cards might need adapting or extending or changing in interesting ways. We were then, of course, hit by the pandemic. And so one of the things we're doing now is taking the cards online, importing them into tabletop gaming platforms, Tabletopia, or various other possibilities. And then the only other thing I'd note, this is a bit of just a hint at some of the other interesting research you can do in this space. We realized that how people use the cards is in itself valuable data. If you could track which cards are used by which people in which combination and show them back to them, they could reflect on their design thinking. So we made an AR, augmented reality app that scans and recognizes the cards. And when you've essentially done a design session, you can quickly log the cards that you used in your particular design. And then we can build visualizations such as the one on the right. We don't need to talk in any detail about this, other than to say it shows the popularity of cards across all the museums that we worked with and the co-occurrences of cards. And what you could do is you could pull out any one designer or institution, and you could see which particular concepts they work with and start to think about how that relates to the global whole. And that maybe tells you something as an institution about your particular design thinking and where it sits in the broader world. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, if everyone could maybe pop back on screen so that we can have a bit of a chat for our remaining time and address some questions. So we've got one here about the kind of gifting concept and platform, and whether we've thought about applying it to other sectors like live performance, music, and I know that both Jocelyn and Steve will have things to say about that, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, we're doing a fair bit of work with the consumer goods sector. So you might want to think about how you can digitally wrap chocolate and all sorts of other products. That's one of the things that I think Jocelyn's working on this week. Jocelyn, you might say more about music. I know you've looked at that in the past.
So I did a project with a couple of colleagues a couple of years back, which were about a project which was about taking people on an audio walk through the center of Nottingham, and at various points having them stop. And it's sort of similar to what Blast Theory ended up doing, although I claim no credit, having people be sort of walked through an experience that put them in a particular frame of mind that had to do with gifting. This one used a fictional story as kind of a backdrop and a lot of sensory overload. And then at various points they would be stopped and asked to think, so what song would you give to your friend right now? And then at 2 points, we actually had them stopped by live performers performing the part of people in this fictional world, who asked them not only what song they had come up with, but to record for their friend why it is they chose that. And this took a lot of heavy manual work, but we ended up actually compiling everything together, and then people were able to experience through live performance this audio walk where they heard the songs that the people had chosen for them and then heard why they had chosen them. And we got very similar responses. We had some people thinking about possibly getting married. We had one couple actually decide to split up. It was pretty intense. And again, there's latitude for however you want to do this. And that's what's so beautiful about this type of personalization, is that the person thinks of the relationship that's on their mind, and it can be deep and meaningful and I want to be with you forever, or it can be, hey, this is a fun laugh, isn't it? And anything in between, and it all works. And yes, we are working on a project with consumer goods, so we're looking at trying to again leverage the emotional importance of gifting and personal relationships when it comes to things like Christmas presents, Valentine's Day presents. Chocolates are always good, yes.
I was going to ask Hilary then, from the point of view of a museum or gallery, how does this idea of kind of personalizing the experience and turning it into a gift from one individual to another, how does that kind of fit in with the way you think about the museum experience?
I think it's a really fascinating extension of a museum visit. And I suppose the caveat I'd say, as someone who speaks for a visual arts museum, I am their director of digital. So I quite naturally think beyond the bounds of the gallery and outside the physical space. That's generally where I'm to be found. But I think anything that like this that takes what's really vital and what's really precious about visiting a museum with someone you care about, someone who knows you and cares about you, and taking that and making that work even when you're not together, but also taking the experience of the museum outside the museum or the gallery walls and into people's pockets in their devices, I think is really valuable and very fascinating. I'm also, in what this might, what signals this might give us about future business models, particularly around membership, or an extension of being a member, or inviting people into membership, or some kind of, and also gallery tours. So, and what that might mean for visiting in small groups as well as individuals or pairs. So I think there's lots of different ways to sort of take this idea, and I'm fascinated to see what this project finds for us in terms of how people are using it across different cultures and using it in this kind of new post-pandemic world. Because I think there are lots of threads we can pull on there that might point to other areas where we might want to develop this.
So there are some fascinating follow-up points coming up in the chat, but just before turning to those, I wanted to ask Gabriella, because obviously you picked out some really great examples earlier on, and I just wondered how what Jocelyn was describing in terms of the audience reaction to using the gift app, how that kind of fits with what we understand about audience feelings of personalised museum and gallery experiences.
There are a lot of examples of personalization which I didn't discuss, and largely I didn't discuss them because the engagement was not necessarily always strong or positive or as rewarding. And so it's interesting if you actually look at the various ones that I did mention, what they might have in common, and what they also have in common with the gifting app is something to do with reaching into something very personal, whether it's a curator that talks to you directly, or whether it's an item of clothing that you can bring home. There's something here which has got to do about a moment of generosity and a moment of giving and receiving, and really through that entering someone else's life. So I think the gifting app, and of course, I'm not going to now unpack the kind of anthropology of the term gift, but the gifting app carries that really personal act of giving. And so receiving, and through that you then see another world, or you then perceive another world. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that art does. And so the gifting app can extend that, as Hilary was saying. Nobody's replacing the beautiful pleasure of actually seeing the art in a museum, but this is an extension and an augmentation, if you like, of something that is already incredible.
So that idea of augmentation fits really well with these other comments in the chat about whether there's any tension around a business model of digital gifting that maybe is threatening for in terms of the kind of purchasing and giving of real gifts, or whether it's about wrapping and augmenting. So I know that's something Steve can speak to.
Yeah, two kind of quick comments. We talk about kind of hybrid gifting and hybrid wrapping, and when you start to think about it, it becomes quite interesting in what wraps what. So with the kind of Blast Theory app, you seem to be wrapping a museum exhibit or visiting experience in a digital personal message. But we've had students play with it the other way around. We had one of our design students, Hyson, she wrapped digital music tracks in candles. So you burnt the candle and it played the track as a gift. Now that's the other way around. The payload is the track and the physical object is the wrapping that you then kind of consume. So you can kind of augment and wrap physical and digital in kind of opposite ways. The other comment was, are there tensions? I think there are. One of the links I pasted in is arguing that it's not really personalization, it's interpersonalization. And the role of the museum in that is quite challenging, to step back and let people make their own interpretations, no matter what they are, and deal with that, I think does open up quite a tension.
I think if I could just add to that, you know, it's not a coincidence that the kind of bigger vision that we have is that of the connected museum. So absolutely, it's the connecting of individuals and their stories that is really at the heart of this work.
I think I'd also just add to that, just from a museum's perspective. We know from other cultural forms that a digital experience actually increases people's propensity to consume that form in its traditional format as well. You know, people download as many films as they can. They'll still go to the cinema when we can. I don't think that there's a risk to having taking a digital experience that takes the museum outside of the museum or the gallery walls. I don't think that puts a visit to museums or galleries at risk. I think actually what it does is distribute the concept and the idea and sort of expands the capacity of what a museum can do in people's lives.
Wanted to take some findings from this previous project that we're looking to extend into working between China and the UK, because a lot of what we found, I loved, Gabriella, your use of the word generosity, because that's very much what it was about, was people wanting to share. So you had people describing looking at the entire museum through new eyes. So people, it was a local city museum. So you have people there who go, you know, every week with the kids, and then all of a sudden they're thinking about what another person would be seeing. And so they're having a brand new experience. And you also had people who were in Brighton when the rest of their family wasn't and probably would never come. And they really wanted to share something of their experience. And so in both cases, you had the museum reaching out, and you had the person being motivated to share it. And then you would have receivers say, oh, I never thought of it that way, or then wanting to look to see what that person had seen. So yeah, there are creative tensions, but we saw very few actual tensions, like in the sense of difficulties, and certainly not in the case of, you know, a real gift versus a digital gift. It's all about them working together to sort of create a virtuous circle.
Well, I think on that really positive and pleasant idea of a virtuous circle, we've come to the end of the time for the session. So I think it's a good point for us to finish and sign off. And we hope that everyone's found this interesting this afternoon. We've really enjoyed being here, and look forward to seeing you on future occasions, I'm sure.